Yeah, so the title of my talk is Hermeneutics Beyond Realism, because to say it's beyond the real is already to commit yourself to being a realist, right, in some way. Yeah, so does everybody have a handout? No? Yeah, so I'll pass those along. And I just have a rough outline of my talk on the board because I didn't get it in handout form in time. But yeah, you're right. Hermeneutics is a particular brand, and here I'm going to be talking about the hermeneutics of Hans Georg Gadamer. And I tend to use the term hermeneutics to stand for Gadamer, which makes a lot of other hermeneutics really angry, like Mark isn't here, but what about Ricoeur and others? But I mean, part of the reason I do that is because if I give a talk on Gadamer, honestly, how many people are going to show up? I mean, I'd like to think a lot. But so anyway, I tried to make it a little more inclusive, so it's not precise. It's more for advertising reasons that I use that. So there is hermeneutics beyond Gadamer as well. Okay, so I'm going to begin with a brief history of the alleged origins of metaphysical realism. That's just a little bit of the talk, and then the most of my talk will focus on two, but I'll explain why I want to talk about the history. But first let me start with a definition of metaphysical realism, and here I'm lumping all realisms together: metaphysical, scientific, internal, what other forms of realism are there? Perspectival, pragmatic. I'm sort of lumping them all together because in my mind, if you're any sort of realist, ultimately you are a metaphysical realist, but I'm not going to really argue that today. But anyway, metaphysical realism, which, as we'll see in a moment, which is generally traced back to Plato, essentially is the belief that reality exists, or there's something out there that exists independently of our minds. And usually the further claim that prior to our minds, right? I mean, it exists prior to us, prior to humans, prior to our attempt to know it. It's out there separately from it. And that if we want to know, if we want to claim to have knowledge about anything, then we have to make sure that our minds accurately, pick your favorite sort of image here, metaphor here, grab hold of reality, reflect reality, map onto, represent reality, right? So this is a picture of knowledge stemming from, and truth stemming from metaphysical realism, right? That there's this accuracy here, which also can be described essentially as the correspondence theory of truth, which first, I suppose, formulated by Aristotle is to say of what is, that it is to speak the truth. So if I say there's a tree out there, there's a red tree out there, and there is a tree out there, right, I'm speaking truth, right? Assuming that tree exists independently to my mind and to my assertions about it. All right, so what do we want to get out of metaphysical realism? So hermeneutics is always interested in trying to discern the question behind a given statement. Right? Anytime somebody makes a statement or a claim, we want to think about what motivated that. What is it trying to answer? Statements just don't fall down from the sky, just don't emerge from thin air, aren't just made by people. Right, so this is what I want to ask about metaphysical realism. What is it that lies behind the metaphysical realist assertion that there's a reality out there? And what I find interesting here is that I think that the realist ultimately wants to give an adequate account of constraint, specifically epistemic constraint. Right? This is why we need metaphysical realism, according to the realist, right? That unless I can say there's something out there, what is going to constrain my beliefs? What's going to prevent me from saying anything I want to? Right? So reality, then, the function of reality actually becomes to act as a constraint on our belief. Right? Reality provides the only guarantee for knowledge. Otherwise, I just skepticism, right? I could say whatever I want to. I see a blue elephant, right, walking around or something like that. And the realist wants to say, no, that's wrong because there's no blue elephant there in reality. Okay, so this sort of constraint is what I mean here. Okay, what's wrong with this picture? I mean, on one level, not too much, but on the philosophical level, I think a fair amount. And there've been numerous criticisms and attacks on realism over the past decades and years. But what I want to try to focus on today is specifically what hermeneutics can bring to the table. And I think this is interesting because it's also a move to help sort of bring the two schools of philosophical thought together, right, the analytic and the continental. And this is actually part of a larger interest of mine to see, well, does hermeneutics actually add anything new that other criticisms, the sort of more analytic criticisms of realism, haven't already said? And so my own work has been focused a lot on that of, say, Richard Rorty, who's a strong anti-realist, Hilary Putnam, who wants to be a realist, which I can't quite understand why. Maybe someday I'll figure that out. So my own thought sort of lies somewhere between Putnam and Rorty, just to situate that, but coming from sort of a different history. Okay, so was Plato really a metaphysical realist? Again, the main point of my talk today isn't going to be to sort of argue or demonstrate that he wasn't, but to suggest that. And the reason I want to suggest it is because it has some implications for some conclusions that I want to draw. All right. So, and the further thing is, again, if we can understand what motivated Plato, then perhaps again getting at what was his ultimate concern can also help reconfigure the contours of the debate. Right? So questioning whether he was really a metaphysical realist is also to question his motivation. What was he really concerned with? What were his philosophical worries? What were his philosophical concerns? And I want to state that ultimately Plato's fundamental concern was not epistemological, but ethical. All right, and so this already moves him away a little bit from metaphysical realism, which again, as I've described it, is primarily a concern for epistemic constraint. Although, of course, there are realist positions undergirding a lot of ethical positions as well. So if we ask, what was Plato afraid of? This is a good question to ask of all philosophers, right? What was Descartes afraid of? What was Kant afraid of? What was Plato afraid of? And I think we can certainly answer that he feared the relativism that was espoused by the sophists, right? So these sophists, these itinerant thinkers, were off in other cities, very cosmopolitan, saw many different opinions, came back and said, well, look, they say this over here, other people say it here, so there's no one truth, right? I mean, if you only live within 10 miles, you never travel within 10 miles of your home and you don't have access to internet or something, then you're pretty happy with the truth that your parents and your family and your community have told you. Okay, so the traditional story goes then that the only way to really contend against this relativism was for Plato to posit something that transcended, right, these contingent communities, that transcended our human knowledge. And what was this but the forms, right, his forms, truth, good, beauty, amongst others. And so, yes, I don't want to deny the forms, the importance of the forms for Plato, but I want to ask, what did he, well, I'm going to ask it, I won't be able to answer adequately. What did he really mean by the forms? And I want to question whether they really were his sort of metaphysical realist statement. Were they really an affirmation of metaphysical realism? Are the forms, in other words, reducible to reality? Something like that, right, that constrains us. So we can only have knowledge, according to Plato, if the forms exist, right? The form of truth exists that allows us to have knowledge. So I think there's something generally correct about that, but I think we go too far when we want to sort of contort this into a metaphysical realism. And I think again, I'm not going to really be able to defend this claim, but let me just say a couple things about it. I think that ultimately Plato's antidote against the relativism of the sophists was not the forms per se, right? So they were obviously a crucial part of his theory, but they weren't his main weapon against the relativism of the sophists. And what is, I want to suggest, is Socratic dialogue, right? Socratic dialogue. And I spell this out in more detail in my forthcoming book, because Gadamer spends a lot of time looking at Plato and his motivations in a similar way. And so there I sort of develop in more detail what then are the forms for, right? What can we say of the forms? But anyway, for now, I just want to say that Plato's main weapon against the sophists was dialogue, Socratic dialogue, because it's Socratic dialogue that formed the basis and made possible Plato's own dialectic, right? Plato's own dialectic, because what was emerging from the sophists was in one instance was, let's say, the Eleatic dialectic, which is something akin to what we find in debating clubs. I don't know, is there a debating club on campus? This is it, okay. Good. I didn't know I had sophists here in front. I thought it was a philosophy. So the Eleatics had this way of debating, essentially, much like in debating clubs, where you're given a viewpoint. Let's say, euthanasia is wrong. You're given that arbitrarily. You're told euthanasia is right. You have to argue. Whether you believe in that or not, you have to try to defeat your opponent. And this is really a form of relativism, right? Because if you can come up with a stronger argument for defeating the value of euthanasia, but you really don't believe in it, then that's really bizarre, right? So there's a sort of relativism, I think, that follows from this. And so the way that Plato tried to override this relativism, counter this relativism, was developing his own dialectic, which was to be grounded in the dialogue of Socrates. And so when we look at, so Plato is concerned with constraint, but it's a dialogical constraint. And I would say ultimately this pushes us more to the realm of ethics, right? Dialogue, since it concerns other people, is something more ethical, right, than purely epistemological. And the forms, let me just say briefly, so the forms then are going to serve as assumptions for knowledge. But anyway, I'm not going to be able to get into that, but I'll just throw that out there. Okay, so, and as you see in my conclusion, that hermeneutics, this is the reason I'm talking about this very quickly, is because hermeneutics, Gadamer's hermeneutics really tries to, I think, recover the unity of truth and the good, which was there all along in Plato. So I think increasingly in modern thinking, Descartes and after, we tend to separate truth from the good. And that's been a problem then. A whole host of problems actually emerged from that. But it's hermeneutics move, I think, ultimately through the work of Gadamer and through Gadamer's interest in Plato to bring us back to this recovery. So that's why the importance of dialogue. All right. So on to my next point, so the body of my talk, and how is hermeneutics a move beyond metaphysical realism? And first I want to say that hermeneutics affirms that there's no fundamental separation between mind and world, language, reality, subject, object, right? All of these dualisms that make metaphysical realism possible, right? I mean, you can't really have metaphysical realism unless you posit that there's a world out there, remember how I define it, apart from yourself, right? So we think of Descartes, right? I'm the knowing subject. How do I know this table really exists? Right? The metaphysical realists have been trying to provide a bridge that allows us to talk about knowledge. Without that bridge, we have no knowledge. Everything, again, is relative, arbitrary. And so here I actually argue against a number of commentators on Gadamer many commentators actually on Gadamer try to make him some sort of realist, because they're worried about losing the world and truth. But I don't think that's the case. So just to differentiate my view from others. All right, so Gadamer's hermeneutics then rejects these traditional dualisms that metaphysical realism affirms. But if hermeneutics denies any form of realism, right, then does it devolve into relativism? I mean, if we want to do away with reality out there, then is it the case that anything goes? Or as Nietzsche put it, if all there is interpretation, are we free, as some interpret Nietzsche here, to make up the world as we go along? Right? I have my interpretation, you have your interpretation. There's no world out there constraining us, telling which of us is right. Then aren't we all sort of relativists? And let me say here that Gadamer doesn't discuss realism directly. He never takes on this debate directly. So what I'm doing is looking at what he says about a text and sort of extrapolating from that and developing a sort of anti-realist stance. Because after all, someone asked, and this was sort of the debate in the 70s and 80s and with Hirsch and others, right? If there's no text there, what are we interpreting, right? If you're going to tell me if I'm going to say there's no world, there's no text, then what are we doing when we interpret? I mean, we're just sort of all playing mind games, solipsistic mind games, right? Okay, so if you want to look on your handout, does everybody have a handout? This one, oh, thanks. I put a handout for some of the quotations, just so you can follow along. All right, so that Gadamer rejects a fundamental separation between subject-object, knower known. Ultimately, what I'm saying, these sort of dualisms or separations lead to relativism. That he rejects these can be seen in his insistence at the close of Truth and Method that his whole inquiry has been guided by the basic idea that language is a medium where I and world meet, or rather manifest their original belonging together. To come into language does not mean that a second being is acquired, right? So it's not that we have language first, or have being first, and then we come into language is produced, yielding a second being, right? Being one and being two, or being two is language. Rather, what something presents itself as belongs to its own being, right? So the presentation of being, which is another way of describing language, is ultimately inseparable from that being itself, right? So that might sound a little opaque, but essentially this is what I'm going to try to explain what this means in the rest of the talk. A similar emphasis occurs in his discussion, in Gadamer's discussion of the I and thou relation, right? This terminology that he borrows from Buber, the theologian. Which he describes as derivative, a derivative one to the extent that in the beginning there is no I versus thou, but they're joined together. So Gadamer writes, the formulation I and thou already betrays an enormous alienation. There is nothing like an I and thou at all. There is neither the I nor the thou as isolated substantial realities. We all know that to say thou to someone presupposes a deep common accord. Something enduring is already present when this word is spoken. So, I mean, now of course in English we don't use the term thou anymore, but it's informal, much like if you know German, like the du, Russian toy, right? I mean, we have these informal uses of you. So, I mean, we could think of what's something comparable today. I mean, maybe a word that you call an intimate other, you know, beloved, or I don't know if anybody really says beloved anymore, but I mean, it's interesting. I was trying to think, we don't really have like a standard terminology, right? Maybe that's good. But maybe an appropriate one would be something more like mama or papa. And we can think here, right, in the Bible when Jesus says, call your heavenly Father daddy, right? Papa, papi, right? This is what this, and why this intimacy here, this informal language betrays a deeper commitment. Right? God isn't something out there other. We're already connected with God. We already have an intimate relationship with God. And so this is Gadamer's point, that when you say this intimate word to another, it presupposes a connection, hopefully, right? You don't just go up to anybody and say, oh, my beloved, right? I mean, that would be a little awkward. All right, so hopefully this is becoming clearer, right? To say this, to make a distinction I and thou is not to say that we begin with a separation, right? I and thou emerges from a more fundamental connection, right? And you can see a lot, for those of you who know Heidegger, you can see a lot of Heideggerian themes here, right? This thrownness into the world. Okay, so what Gadamer, following Heidegger, then wants to help us glimpse here is the original belonging together of world and language. Right? This is where we start. There's this intimate connection between world and language. And it's interesting that although Gadamer's writing is infused with a lot of Christian imagery, I think here we might want to say he departs at least from a standard biblical interpretation in which we say the Word was first, right, creating the world. Here I think Gadamer would want to say that Word and world are what? Coeval, right? They're occurring together. There's a primordial unity here. But this unity is not one that's monistic. It's not where no difference is at play, but there is a unity of difference, right? There's a way of belonging together, of being one that does not reduce you to one, right? Again, you could think of of intimate relationships, right? You're one. We speak you're one in a marriage, but you're not. That doesn't mean you're literally, literally one. Okay. So what does this mean then? Language emerges not so much as a reflection of something given, and actually this is a quotation I didn't write down. Language is not so much a reflection of something given, but it's a coming into language, but language is a coming into language of a totality of meaning, right? A totality of meaning is coming out here. Language and world emerge together to such an extent that it's not possible to separate them in this initial moment, or ever in a neat and final way. And that's not to say that we can't separate language and world, right? Gadamer's not against method, and he's not saying that there's no room for historical critical analysis or new criticism or semiotics or linguistic theory, et cetera, right? It's not that those are wrong-headed, but they just presuppose a more fundamental relationship. All right, so to affirm our existence then is characterized by interpretation means not to affirm the world as object that must be approached by the interpreting subject, right, where the two are fundamentally separated. In language, and this is interesting, Gadamer defines language as understood being, right, that being which can be understood. So being that can be understood is what we call language. Right. That part of being that can be understood is what we call language, and this suggests that there's ultimately no distinction again between being and the presentation of being, where presentation of being is like language, So if language and being are originally one, or if language and world are originally one, then Gadamer can't be reduced to the relativist camp that assumes that the world is whatever we want to say about it. Because that picture, the picture of relativism, always assumes that there's a fundamental separation, right? That we start with a separation. The world's out there, and therefore I can say whatever I want about it, right, if I reject realism. Because it's not then that, I mean, think about these images we use for knowing, right? Our mind is reflecting the world. A mirror is something separate than the world, right? If you hold up a mirror and you look at your reflection in it, can't be a mirror, can't be a reflection unless you're apart from the mirror, right? The mirror can't reflect its own reflection unless it's reflecting through another mirror, right? So all this language that we have about knowledge, reflection, mapping onto, getting hold of, assumes this fundamental separation. Okay, but neither is it accurate to say that the world produces language. So if we don't want to say that on Gadamer's view, I create the world, neither do we want to say that the world produces language. That which comes into language is not something that is pre-given before language. That's another quotation from Gadamer. That which comes into language is not something that's pre-given before language, right? Which is what he was getting at in terms of the unity of being and language. So there's little use in scrambling to assure ourselves that our language, that our sentences, our propositions accurately reflect what's there or that causes them, right? Because we're already engaged. We're already engaged with language. To worry about whether our ideas accurately reflect the way the world really is a worry that comes too late. Gadamer uses the image a lot of play, and we could say, I think, on his view that we're played by language. And I would say further that I think on Gadamer's view, it's not only that we're played by language, but that we find ourselves enjoying it. And that means, sort of translated into pragmatic terms, it's useful. Like, we're getting around in the world. We are making sense of the world. We are successful in our world. And just bringing in sort of the pragmatic emphasis here, We could think, I think there's a parallel here between Gadamer and Davidson, who asked the question, what would it mean if all our beliefs were false? Right? I mean, this is sort of the extreme skepticism of Descartes. What if I'm wrong about all my beliefs? And I think the pragmatic answer would be, it's a nonsense question. You're getting around in the world, right? I say the door's there, I go and I open it, I get out. Right? I mean, this is the usefulness, and we can extend this to science too, right? What is the theory that's true? It's the one that works, right? As you're going to elucidate in your time? Do I have to be quiet already? How many more minutes?
We usually end in about 20 minutes, so it would be nice to
Oh.
have some discussion.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry.
So let's see. What should I? All right. So I should fast forward a little bit here to the conclusion. Well, the conclusion's really short. But I mean, we can have discussion anytime. Well, so do you want to just stop for discussion now?
No, I want you to
hit that?
the recovery.
Oh, but I wasn't going to say much about that. I was hoping we'd run out of time before that. So, do you want to? All right, the good without relativism. Well, so I'll skip over this. You can ask me questions about replacing the notion of. Let me talk to this, because actually it's sort of hard to get to my conclusion without this point B. So let me read here. This is your second and third quotations on your sheet. In Text and Interpretation, Gadamer addresses the nature of the supposed given. Right, this is what metaphysical realists have generally said is there, right, the given. Does the given exist as something from whose secure starting point one can search for the universal, the law, the rule, and so find its fulfillment, or is the given not in fact itself the result of an interpretation? Interpretation performs the never fully complete mediation between man and world, and to this extent the fact that we understand something as something is the only real immediacy and givenness. For only in light of interpretation does something become a fact, and only within the process of interpretation is an observation expressible. So what Gadamer wants to replace then this notion of the given with is meaning. Right? When we come to a text, what we're looking for, it's not enough to just point to the text. And I'll just close with this one example, right? In terms of what are we trying to interpret, right? If it's not a text as an object, what is it? And here we could maybe have an example, right? So let's say that Brenda is arguing that the world was created. She says that I read Genesis, and the Bible says that the world was created in 7 24-hour days, right? And Bruce denies this. Okay, so here's a controversy over a text, right? And everybody would, if they're Christians, right, they say we have to point to the text, right? We have to point to the text to solve this problem. So I think the hermeneutical point is that what is the text? It's not that Brenda and Bruce haven't read the Bible. It's not that they haven't read it carefully. It's not that they missed that sentence that said, and after God created the world in 144 hours, God took a rest. Right? I mean, it's not that they're both reading all the words. So when we point to the object, what is it? Are we pointing to the bound book? Are we pointing to the sentences? Are we pointing to the words? Are we pointing to the Hebrew inscriptions? What are we pointing to? No, the meaning. The meaning is what we have to debate over. And this is something that Gadamer says only emerges between the text and the interpreter. There's no meaning there apart from this dialogue, right? So I'm getting to my conclusion, dialogue, right? Gadamer describes this interaction as a dialogue. And that it just does not make sense to posit a text apart from this dialogue. Why is this text problematic? It's already because there's been a dialogue, right? What does the Bible say about the origins of the world? Right? That's a problem of meaning, And so when we start taking seriously then dialogue, right, this move away from realism, I want to say, makes us take more seriously the importance of dialogue, both in terms of knowledge. What is knowledge? So we reject this Cartesian picture of the lone individual coming to knowledge by turning within, isolated from community, history, society, etc. And knowledge is what emerges via this dialogue. And then if we're going to talk about dialogue, we have to take seriously the role of the other in terms of ethical considerations. And so this is why I think dialogue helps sort of deepen our understanding of knowledge and also brings in, makes inseparable ethical considerations from questions of knowledge. All right, so.
Yeah, if you have any questions for me, I'd like to start out. Like, I mean, I like your take on Plato. You know, I mean, the forms are not a reality that most contemporary philosophers accept.
Right.
But what we do like is Socratic dialogue, and to put the emphasis on that, I think is really nice. I just wonder. It seems to me that though there is an emphasis on ethical issues, like on normative issues, what one should do or how one should act. There's also this emphasis on mathematical truths.
Yeah.
And
In Plato's dialectic, you mean? Okay. Yeah.
The slave boy, for instance. And I'm just wondering if even like that slave boy passage, whereas supposedly Socrates is drawing out this geometrical knowledge from slave boy, if that can still be construed as finding meaning rather than a given.
Yes, I would say it is, and actually there's a book that just come out on Gadamer's thought on the inner word in Gadamer, and Gadamer writes about 10 pages on Augustine's notion of the inner word, and this is something that's always troubled Gadamerians a lot, because it seems to say just what I have been trying not to say, but actually this interpretation helps also. I mean, this huge historical study goes back and sort of puts flesh on what Augustine actually meant by this term. And so I would say that, yeah, it's not a given, because for Augustine, for example, the word is sort of emerges like the Trinity, right? The Trinity's there, but what is it? Right? I mean, there's something there it's a unity of meaning. Again, it's sort of this two in one, right? We don't want to say there's nothing there. It's only our own interpretation, but it's not a given. So I would say that this offers a way of sort of deepening our understanding of recollection. As yes, there's something there, but what is there? Is what's there ultimately able to be isolated from the very dialogue out of which the Meno comes to this knowledge, right? I mean, this is interesting that it requires a dialogue. I mean, okay, we might say it's a little forced dialogue, but this imagery of a midwife, right? I mean, bringing something out. Okay, maybe that's not good because it sort of tends toward realism, right? There's actually a baby there. It actually comes out, right? There's not sort of nothing there that, but maybe the preembryo. Okay, I want to get into that, but no, I think that's a really good question, and I think that we could, again, following Augustine here, explore that there's a meaning there ahead of time, but it's not a meaning like propositional, or it's not a natural law, or it's not the idea of a triangle having three sides.
I always thought, I know Mattia, just a second. I always thought, that got impressed on me because, like, what's amazing about that passage is that the slave boy arrives at knowledge which we know to be, I mean, I shouldn't say fact, maybe, but we take to be real.
Right.
And
we take to be real because it's, okay.
I mean, I think that's, the fact that this is known in a way that's like a eureka suggests that there's something extra going on there.
But Gadamer talks about this all the time in terms of understanding occurs as a moment of enlightening. Einleuchtung in German, right? It's this moment, it is this Eureka moment. It is precisely that, but that doesn't mean that something was there prior. So that I'm just...
It's discovery. It's like, I knew it was there, and there it is.
Oh, yeah. It's a discovery. Yeah, it's hard to find language, right, to talk about this, but I would say it's not a discovery of something that was there isolated from you. I mean, where is it in us? Right, where is it in the pineal gland? Right, where is this theory? I mean, where is it? No, I mean, there's a sense that there's a commonality to human language, to human reason, right? There's nothing odd about that. If we all speak language, there's going to be something universal there. Although, again, I want to say that this universal is not to offer some sort of constraint, like in a Kantian sense. We need the universal in order to ... Right? I think here, universality goes hand in hand with language. All language users are connected in some way. And so what comes forth is this outpouring. It's this inner word, right? I mean, how do we understand the separation of the Trinity? Right? We've been trying for hundreds of years to understand that, right? Is the Trinity one? How can we have one God and three? I think, and this is what this book on Gadamer makes the point, and I haven't finished it, but and I don't know if he talks about the Meno in there, but I think this is a good way of dealing with it, right? I mean, there is a unity, but it's not a separate thing, and it's not a distinction between like a proposition I have in my mind that somebody else is trying to pull out, which is sometimes what we take to be Socratic dialogue, or a leading question, right? Or we ask students sometimes, we have an idea of what we want the answer to be, and we ask, okay, now you've got the right proposition. That's not what Plato was about, right? There's a deeper truth here. There's a fundamental connectedness that we all have the ability to know. I think that's what the Meno is about, and this is a point that Gadamer makes, that Aristotle bequeathed to us this propensity to read Plato in a literal way. And Plato is full of metaphors and imagery. And so scientists really bastardize Plato by trying to truncate his theories and ask, where is it? Where is that proposition, Meno? Come on, it's going to come out. Pat you on the back and it'll come out. This is the wrong way of thinking. So, I don't know if I convinced anybody, but yeah, Mattia.
Yeah, I think it's a related question, but more about language itself. I think, as you said, for Gadamer, there's something unique about it, in the sense of being a language of one. And I'm thinking about two passages. One, Heidegger says, language is the house of being. So language dwells in being.
Yeah.
There's a difference there.
Right.
And I'm thinking also about Plato's Republic. That's where he tells that story about his cave, book 7. He says, well, there might be some such thing. Or no, he says, this is what it might look like, but we can't know for sure. But we can know for sure there is some such thing as the sun or whatever.
Before the cave,
so
yeah.
I like your interpretation of Plato because ultimately we can come up with a form as that which is present before us.
Right.
We have to fight with the shadows. We have to rest. But it seems for Heidegger and Plato in this reading, maybe isolating these passages, this point of view, what we see with the help of light, language, is some kind of point of view which is in the foreground. But in the background, there's still being, which language ultimately fails to bring, speak.
Yeah.
And I wonder just how come, what motivates Gadamer to make this different move from Heidegger, your interpretation of Plato, but why?
Well, I mean, first of all, I'm not sure I wouldn't want to distinguish him from Plato on this point, because this is another point about the good, that Gadamer really wants to take seriously Plato's claim that the good is beyond being. And if the good is beyond being, that means finite beings cannot know an infinite thing, right? We are beings. We can't know what's beyond being. And I think metaphysical realism emerges from failing to take that seriously, right? If this form is going to constrain us, then it must be that I as a being can know it. And I think Plato's point is that we can't know it. And you're right. And this is something that Gadamer takes seriously. And this is why, but cryptically. And so this is what I mean, one of the things I try to argue in my book is that the good for what Gadamer helps us shows is really this ontological principle, that it's an assumption of all knowledge. We always have to assume that there's a good. And this is brought out in the Philebus, where they're arguing, does pleasure equal the good? Well, even if you defend that pleasure equals the good, you're appealing to something beyond the moment, right? If I say pleasure equals the good, say, well, I mean, first of all, there are many different pleasures, so how do I know which one to take? And how can I use that language of the good, right, without appealing to something beyond the moment? And so I think this is what Plato shows in the Philebus, that ultimately we need the assumption of the good in order for all rationality to occur. So I don't want to distinguish Gadamer. I think Gadamer is very Platonic here, more Platonic than in the good way than most thinkers. And I also think that for Gadamer, he doesn't want to deny that there's a being that goes beyond language, But here I might say he's a little more Wittgensteinian, and what can we say about it? And I'm not sure that's a lot different than Heidegger, right? But you might be raising a more of a challenge from Ricoeur about sort of this call that comes prior to us. I mean, we sort of had this conversation, I think, before, and actually yesterday in class we were talking about Ricoeur and the difference between Ricoeur and Gadamer, and I think this is a difference, right? Because I think Ricoeur wants to say that there is the unnameable that speaks to us, right, gives us a call, that incites language. This is his clear move to religion. And Gadamer was not religious. And so I think it's not clear whether he'd want to go that far. He doesn't ever explicitly go that far, and I don't think that he would want to, right? So I think that it's a mystery, right? Where does language comes from being? What is being apart from language? How can we know? How can we know it, right? Because our only knowledge comes through language.
So is language the basis of the ethical one as well? That because language is the basis of unity between oneself and another. We want to talk about Ricoeur. For Ricoeur, he seems to be more Levinasian.
Yes, yeah.
So for Gadamer, I'm just thinking, this is still a question, why the unity between being and language? Is that the basis for the ethical relationship?
Yes, yeah. That's the basis. But I think it's different than a Levinasian formulation, because I think for Levinas, there's not really a dialogue that goes on, right? I mean, this is call that comes to us, but you can't refuse it. That's not much of a dialogue, right? Doesn't give you much of an. So he's not. I don't think he's not really going in a Levinasian direction. More, look, what are the requirements for dialogue? What are the requirements for dialogue? Openness, or the willingness to listen, but also the willingness to justify yourself, and that is to risk exposure, right? You don't just sit and passively listen in a dialogue. So I mean, again, this is a whole topic of what's entailed by Gadamerian dialogue and how is this related to the ethical. Grant.
I just have a problem with that interpretation that the person who leaves the cave and accesses the forms returns to the cave and is completely unwilling to communicate, but still in the cave when he still has the truth.
Well, he's not unwilling. It's just difficult.
The other people are unwilling.
Oh, the other people don't want to hear. Yes, yep, right. So what's the result of that? Then they have to be dragged up, which again is a ethical thing. Dragging somebody, right? Force is ethical. Why? Because it involves others. I mean, right? There's this compulsion, there's this dragging up to perceive the form. Although the forms are never looked at right direct. I mean, Plato, the discussion of the sun as the good precedes the allegory of the cave, where Socrates says, look, I mean, I can't really talk about the good, so let's talk about its scion, its heir. Right? Well, let's speak by analogy. What is the sun like? So again, and this I find this fascinating, because Socrates seems to say, it's ambiguous here. Does Socrates know the good, or is he just unwilling at this moment and is he unwilling to talk about it, or does he not know it? I mean, it sort of seems like he knows it and he's unwilling, but then in other readings, so I don't think it's really clear. That's an interesting question. Does Socrates himself know the good, right? But anyway, so the point here is that what is our relationship to the forms, right? Clearly there has to be knowledge of the forms have to come first, whatever that means, and I think that's not a literal knowledge, right, as we learn in the divided line. In fact, many readings of that divided line suggest that Salus actually suggests it's impossible to draw the divided line, and so if it's impossible to draw the divided line, then that knowledge of the forms is never going to be possible, right? Because it's setting up an impossibility. So I think the point of the allegory of the cave is, again, an ethical point. It's not about knowledge ultimately. It's about what? We have to go back down. Those of us who have seen this knowledge have a responsibility, right? Plato is not about ascending for one's own solipsistic bliss. Right now, here I am, in front of the good or something, right? It's about going back down. We have to bring this knowledge to other people. So again, I think it's really hard to see at any moment when Plato's discussing knowledge, a removal of the ethics, how this is separated from our responsibility to others. What is the good? It's the good of the whole. The good of the whole is important, right? It's not just ordering ourselves, but it's helping other people order themselves, which is why Socrates was a true politician. So, but you're not very happy with that.
It's just that the person who goes back into the cave is incapable of communicating. So
Okay.
access to forms or get the same knowledge is by going by themselves now.
Oh, but they don't go by themselves, right? Then there's an incentive. Yeah, I agree. They're not having sort of a logical, right, here you are, I'm coming back to the cave, I'm going to prove to you, right? No, but there is something provocative, right? There's a compulsion there, and then they're dragged up. So, yeah, it's not an argument that is brought down, but that doesn't mean that it's not dialogical, right? It's not interpersonal, it's not interactive in that way. Again, let's not be too literal, right? Literal about what the knowledge of the forms is. You know, a syllogism or something like that. That's not what they can't hear that. But I think there's something else going on.
Well, time is up.
Okay.
But I think in many ways, Professor Barthold just dragged us out of the cave. I appreciate that. Thank you so much.
And I have black eye. Thank you.